Halito. So hochefo Bethany Hughes. Hello, my name is Bethany Hughes. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. It is wonderful to see all of you here. There are a few seats available. If there is a seat available next to you, you might wave a friend over to join that. We have plenty of people standing in the back. I'm honored to serve as your MC. And now if there's a hand raised, that means someone is obligated to go fill the seat. You're not gonna make them look like a fool by waving their hand in the air. So fill the seats. Thank you. I'm honored to serve as your MC for this evening and throughout the Living with Treaties conference. We gather here to reflect on an important and timely question. What does it mean to live with treaties? To begin, I'm pleased to welcome Alphonse Pitawanakwat to provide an opening for us. Alphonse is a certified language instructor through Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, whose first language is Anishinaabe-Moine. Alphonse is an enrolled member of Wikwemagong Unceded Indian Reserve on Manitoulin Island in Canada. He has been teaching the language for over 15 years at the University of Michigan after retiring from General Motors as a general supervisor in plant engineering and manufacturing for 33 years. I invite no math to be done. He is also a language instructor at Nokomis Learning Center in Okemos, Michigan. Following Alphonse's opening, we will be hearing from the University of Michigan's Native American Student Association's Stick City. Please join me in giving Alphonse and Stick City a warm welcome.
Howdy. I was a little afraid to come up here when I saw this thing to stand in the back of, because I often run into these that are too tall and you can't hear me when I speak. And even there were some that were transparent podiums. You recall the event behind that. So I've had fun with it since then. Right after I started at General Motors, that's when that happened. So I usually stay away from that, from behind there. Okay, my name is Alphonse Pitawanakwat. I am from Manitoulin Island, Canada, and I've been in the States for 57 years. I retired from General Motors after 33 years. And I faced a family problem at the time, so I decided I had to do something, so I thought I'd return to school and be able to teach the Ojibwe language, which has been my entire language. I never spoke English until I was maybe 12 years old, because we weren't speaking it. It wasn't there. There was nobody to speak to with the language, English language. But I tried very hard to get to know the language, because I carried a backpack of books all the time, no matter what I did. When I went to the woods, I carried a bunch. My dad used to get angry at me for carrying books. What are you going to do with those? I'm going to be reading them when you're sleeping. I'm going to use a flashlight. And that didn't save me either, because you're going to kill the batteries. You won't have any light at all. So, but I still managed to get away every other second. And so I've been here about 16 years now, working with Kayla. And as we go along, we get to see how we should improve on how we teach the language, because there's a language that has been unwritten, and we didn't have any material to work with. as far as fluent speakers doing it. You have to be a fluent speaker in order to bring it up, because the words carry the meanings. Unlike other words that you see in other languages, it's not the same. So we try to improve every year. The last class we did, we tried to improve that a class ahead of it, and we continue doing that. And as we go along, we get to know and understand more than we went in with. So it gets to be more enjoyable when you have an idea of what you're doing. But yes, that's where we are with it. I'm hoping I can hang in there for a while yet and help out. There seems to be a strong desire to continue it. I was at MSU on Monday, and a lot of people were requesting material in order to carry on with what they have, what little they have. So I'm already doing some work over there at Nokma Center in East Lansing area. I don't have much more time to do it, so it gets tiresome doing it. But we still have fun. Every Wednesday night we're over there. We always have new people coming in wanting to understand a little more than they currently do. So that's where we are at this point. Do you have any questions you might want? I saw a lot of questions in the books that I was reading here. Must be they went through all our classes. Or did you?
Thank you, sir. Where right now, I've been to Thunder Bay, beautiful area up there by northern Lake Superior. Is that area by any chance where you'll find most people speaking this language?
No, that's where 11% of the population at Thunder Bay is natives, Anishinaabe, Crees and Ojibways, Chippewas, and a lot of students go there to get their certification. And it's still going strong. In fact, they're doing more than they did when I was there. So it's a non-stop situation. All the universities in Ontario are also working on programs. And she and I hired a professor to come in and help us. So we were working on improving our curriculum, try and get it higher than what we have, just so we have other students wanting to keep on going. So it's coming along very well based on the information that I got at MSU on Monday, and I was there some parts of Tuesday, and that's all they were talking about. What they're doing to improve it is just amazing. It's all ladies working on the little kids. And we were in London, Ontario, a week or 2 weeks ago. And same thing we saw, the same thing over there. Agmenchigem begnom me angshna nangedon ang manjeding with what among manden kamgok Gabhas egin misin gan ki wind magasot ki wind magasot nishnabe qui tem ga kinju kilo magasopa. Abtishko pangi na good ga nakni up or charge. Ki avishko mukita gaso we not more nishnabe. Chicken more ke vishish chiga pugna pinastungo. We de which got egg na I got to be more misin. This was about the Treaty of, or the Article 16, Treaty of Meigs. That was designed by, or desired by the Nishnabek to get help for their education by allowing building of this University of Michigan. And ever since then, it's been on the fighting list. But I'm glad to see that it's moving along. Gitchen dan wam do mai enishes sekwe ni enishes roevok. Chinat maga spogno. Oh, we can one and kit gay. I believe we have some history professors here to talk about that, so I'm going to see what this is. Now, how about me not cognon and beveshik? Hope I have a chance to talk to you again. Come on, pitch go cognon.
Yacht de Shie Kennedy Bakispa Jameson Yanishne Biligana Nishli Tolachini Dashiche wait my bad Tolachini Bashishin Biligana Dashinali and then Nakai Dene Dashiche. My name is Kennedy Jameson. I'm Navajo from Coyote Canyon and I'm the co-chair of Native American Student Association. We're Stick City. We're the singing group from the Native American Student Association, and we're very honored to be able to share a welcome song with you guys today in order to get us in the right headspace for this event. And I'll pass it on to my fellow members now.
Bonjour, my name is Katie Lynch. I'm Citizen Band Potawatomi, and I'm a second-year PhD student studying health infrastructures and learning systems.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jalen Green. I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, and I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student.
Ariel Ojibwe Ninbandagos, Ajijak Ndodam Bawating. Wait, Bawating Ninbandagos, Ariel Indigenous. And I am a supportive staff member from the Hatcher Graduate Library.
Ani, Jackson Indigenous, Amjanong First Nation in Dipendagos. I'm a third-year undergraduate engineering student studying climate and meteorology.
Hello, I'm Cayenne. I'm a member of the Choctaw Apache tribe of Ebarb, and I am a fifth-year PhD student in astronomy.
Ani, Blake Weston Indigenous, Waganakasingodawa, and I am a second year studying economics and Romance languages.
My name is Brett Trevino. I'm Chiricahua Apache, Mescalero Reservation, and I'm a junior in Earth and Environmental Sciences.
Tansei Buju, my name is Selena. I'm Utpemsak Métis, and I'm faculty in Earth and Environmental Sciences.
Annie Buju. My name is Rebecca Irvine. I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and I work in Stamp School of Art and Design.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kylie. I'm a member of Kitigan Zibi First Nation, and I'm in my Master's of Public Health program.
Ani, Naomi Indigenous, Sagamok Nishnabek Indibendigos, and I am a sophomore going into public health sciences.
Ani Vuju. I'm Andrea. I belong to Amjadunk First Nation. I'm the Assistant Director for Native Student Enrichment and Belonging here at U of M and the advisor for NASA.
So this welcome song was shared to us by NASA alums Joe Riley and Frank Bartley, and it's essentially connecting like with our ancestors. The lyrics say, the ancestors, they help us all sing, the ancestors, they help us all dance, which I feel like is very important to remember as we learn from each other and learn at this conference this weekend. So yeah, let's get it started.
Miigwech, Alphonse, Miigwech, Stick City. Thank you also to Ndio Mitchell for your DJ work during the reception. As we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. We're almost to the exciting part after the previous exciting part. When you came in this evening, you should have received a printed program for the Living with Treaties conference. Inside is all of the information you will need for the duration of the conference, schedule of events, information, and importantly, bios for everyone participating. And since you have them in hard copy, I'm not going to read them out loud, so you can look in your program for bios of this evening's participants. There is also cart captioning available for this event. If you turn to page 5 inside, use this QR code on your personal device to access the cart services. And the other QR code is to use after the event. It's a post-event survey that you can take after tonight, after the conference, as many times as you would like. And this helps us by letting us know how this event is resonating and impacting with you, and also gives us information on how we can do this work better in the future. At this time, I am delighted to be representing the University of Michigan's Inclusive History Project. I am the lead principal investigator for one of its foundational large-scale research initiatives, the 1817 Project, Land, Culture, Memory, and Repair. The Inclusive History Project is a major university-wide initiative dedicated to documenting and sharing a more comprehensive history of U of M, one that includes its histories of inclusion and exclusion and stretches across the Ann Arbor, Dearborn, and Flint campuses and Michigan Medicine. Teams of researchers composed of students, staff, faculty, and community members are currently pursuing a dozen large-scale research projects that range across more than 200 years of the university's history. These projects are expanding and enriching our understanding of this institution, past and present. Through deep research and meaningful engagement with communities on and beyond this campus and our campuses, the IHP is not only working to produce a more inclusive history of this university, we are working toward a more inclusive and a more just present and future. The 1817s Project's own research and engagement efforts are a foundational part of the IHP. You will have the opportunity over the course of this conference to hear more about the project and our work from my co-principal investigators and our remarkable research team. I speak for our team when I say welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. We will now move on to our opening remarks. We are honored to have University of Michigan President Grasso with us this evening, who will give remarks and who will be followed by Professor John Carson. John Carson is an associate professor of history and joins us this evening to offer a welcome on behalf of the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, which is a co-sponsor for this evening's event. As the 8th director of the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, serving from 2022 to 2025, he was key to conceptualizing tonight's events. We are thankful to John, current EIH Director Dario Gaggio, and their staff for partnering with us to make this event possible. Before he speaks, Dr. Domenico Grasso will speak. Dr. Grasso was appointed president of the University of Michigan in May 2025 by the Board of Regents, and for the previous 7 years before that, he served as an executive officer of the university and the chancellor of UM Dearborn. He is a Michigan alum who earned his doctorate in environmental engineering in 1987. President Grasso has been a leader of the universities of Delaware, Vermont, and Connecticut, as well as at Smith College, where he founded the country's first engineering program at a women's college. Please join me in welcoming President Domenico Grasso.
Thank you very much, Professor Hughes. And as president of the university, I would be incredibly remiss if I did not welcome you to the home of the 2026 NCAA men's basketball champions. And as luck would have it, my wife, Susan, who's joined me here today, and I were supposed to fly out this morning to Las Vegas to catch the first round of the Frozen Four, where we are playing. And we decided that this was more important, so we're here for this event. However, we hope to win tonight, and we'll be flying out tomorrow night for the finals on Saturday. So I would like to welcome all of our visiting scholars, teachers, and distinguished guests. We appreciate your engagement with this complex research initiative that we are undertaking here at Michigan. Research, of course, is at the heart of our institution. It is our lifeblood as a university that society looks to for answers, treatments, and solutions. One of my favorite observations comes from Louis Pasteur, who called laboratories the temples of the future. Quote, he said, "It is here that humanity will grow, strengthen, and improve." Our entire university is a laboratory of the human experience, a place of deep exploration and critical inquiry. We are not limited by high-powered microscopes and sterile beakers, essential as they are. Rather, we approach the world as a profoundly complex entity that merits explanation and empathy. That is the commitment of our Inclusive History Project, which is driven by rigorous scholarship that helps to explore and explain our past, no matter how comfortable it may be, and shape a better future. Our university is also a place shaped by a treaty, specifically the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs. It's in its first month, the University of Michigania acquired more than 1,900 acres of native land through the treaty, and later sold that property to pay off debts. The Inclusive History Project and its 1817 project have contributed much to our understanding of this treaty and its ramifications, including the lived experiences of Native American students here at Michigan. Treaties are more than ink on yellowed paper. They are integral to our understanding of American history and American life. They have shaped our nation physically, culturally, educationally, and economically. We see this in the diverse academic disciplines partnering in this conference. We must examine these historic agreements through many lenses to truly understand their consequences. I want to thank the leadership of the Inclusive History Project, the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, and the 1817 Project for their thoughtful approach to this conference. I am confident everyone will come away from the sessions with a deeper understanding of treaty agreements. And I am certain there will be more questions, more discussions, and more ideas for future papers and initiatives. This outcome is what Pasteur envisioned when he said that it is here where humanity will grow, strengthen, and improve. I can think of no higher objective for a conference such as this one. Thank you all for being here, and it is now my distinct pleasure to turn over the program to Professor John Carson.
I got up here without falling. Very good. So hi, everybody. Welcome. It's wonderful to see such a full room. It's a testament to the interest in the subject, in treaties, in the place of Native American peoples in the history of the University of Michigan, of the efforts of a number of people, and a wonderful kind of vision of what this future conference will be, and of the kind of close cooperation which has now gone on for a number of years between the Inclusive History Project and the Eisenberg Institute. So thanks, President Grasso, for those thoughtful and generous remarks to open us up. I'm so glad to be here and to represent the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies at this wonderful joint event with the Inclusive History Project. The Eisenberg Institute and the IHP have collaborated, as I've said, on a number of occasions, and each time it has underscored for me the value and importance of bringing careful historical inquiry on important topics to a broad public such as yourselves. This evening, we are so happy that you could join us for what I know will be a wonderful and enlightening conversation among our panelists about the past, present, and future of Indigenous history, including the fundamental issue of treaties and their downstream effects that go even into the present. To provide a little context for the event, it is the fourth in the Eisenberg Institute's annual lecture conversation series that seeks to bring some of the contributions of historians into dialogue with the concerns and questions of the broader community at UM, in Ann Arbor, and throughout Southeast Michigan, and more broadly. The Eisenberg Institute itself was founded in 2004 on the belief that a well-informed citizenry requires access to and instruction in deeply researched and thoughtfully analyzed stories about the past. Thanks to the generous gifts from our benefactors, Kenneth and Francis Eisenberg, the Institute's mission has been to amplify and extend the research, teaching, and public engagement of the history department's faculty and graduate students, guided by the belief that historical studies make a productive difference in our world even today. Before I finally turn to introducing tonight's remarkable roundtable panelists, I should acknowledge some of the contributions and labor that have helped to make this event possible. Eisenberg staff members Joseph Ho and Elizabeth Collins have worked with Inclusive History Project members Jennifer Junkermeyer-Kahn, Jonathan Quint, Mira Shetty, Elle Costanzo, Kennedy Clark, Shuni's homes, and many others behind the scenes, and sometimes in the foreground, to bring together all the elements necessary to ensure that we would be in a position tonight to enjoy the intellectual festivities. I'll ask you to give a round of applause for their efforts, in addition to those of the many individuals who helped set up the room, provided nourishment at the reception, and will clean up afterwards. Their labor, visible and invisible, is crucial to the success of events such as this. Let's give them all a very heartfelt. Finally, let me turn to some much too brief introductions of this evening's extraordinary group of panelists. Ned Blackhawk is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History at Yale University, where he researches and teaches about Native American and U.S. history and co-directs the NYU-Yale American Indian Sovereignty Project, a multi-institutional research and advocacy initiative that aims to redress misunderstandings of federal Indian law and support the scholarly development of American Indian legal history. Author and co-editor of 5 works in Indigenous studies, his recent book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples, and the Unmaking of U.S. History, was a national bestseller that won several major awards, including the National Book Award for Nonfiction. It has been translated into 8 foreign languages and will soon appear in a young adult version with 7 Stories Press. It is, as you all probably know, a must-read. His current work focuses on the aftermath of the 7 Years' War and the place of Native nations in the unfolding Revolutionary War, portions of which were featured last year in the Boston Globe and the Atlantic. Excuse me. He is a member of the Tamok tribe of the Western Shoshone Indians of Nevada. Maggie Blackhawk, who unfortunately is in a delayed flight, and we are hoping will be able to come here at some point, but we will just keep our collective fingers crossed, but I will introduce her nonetheless in the hopes that she can indeed make it, is professor of law at New York University and a prize-winning scholar and teacher of federal Indian law, constitutional law, and legislation. Maggie Blackhawk was awarded the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Article Prize, and her research has been published or is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Review, Yale Law Journal, excuse me about that, Supreme Court Review, American Historical Review, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Journal of the Early Republic, and Journal of Politics. Obviously a very accomplished and very wonderful scholar. Much of her scholarship explores the relationship between law and power, with a particular emphasis on the ways that subordinated peoples leverage law to shift power to their communities, especially outside of rights and courts-based frameworks. Her recent projects have focused on the laws and legal histories of American colonialism and the central role of the American colonial project, including the resistance and advocacy of Native and other colonized peoples in shaping the constitutional law and history of the United States. She is a member of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. Gregory Dowd is Helen Hornbeck Tanner Collegiate Professor of American Culture and History at the University of Michigan. His many administrative roles at UM have included being Associate Dean for the Humanities, Chair of American Culture, and Director of Native American Studies. Greg's several published books and many articles primarily explore the history of the Native North American East before 1850, though he has also touched on research on the history of South Africa, where he was a Fulbright Fellow in 1994 and a Research Fellow in 2015-16 at the University of Witwatersrand. He has had several fellowships, and his current work is supported in part by the Michigan Humanities Award. He has won 2 teaching awards. He has worked for tribes in a treaty rights case. He received his PhD in history at Princeton and his BA in history from the University of Connecticut. And he is one of our most distinguished Native American historians here at the university. Matthew L.M. Fletcher is the Harry Burns Hutchins Collegiate Professor of Law and Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan. He teaches and writes in the areas of federal Indian law, American Indian tribal law, Anishinaabe legal and political philosophy, constitutional law, federal courts, and legal ethics. He sits as the Chief Justice of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and the Poash Band of Creek Indians. He also sits as an appellate judge for a number of Native American tribes and bands. Matthew is the author of The Eagle Returns, The Legal History of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, The Ghost Road, Anishinaabe Responses to Indian Hating, which won several independent publisher awards, and most recently, Tribal Law in a Nutshell. This is a 2026 book, as well as numerous law journals. He has also published a collection of short stories entitled Stick Houses. Matthew is a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. Finally, Michael Witkin is a professor at the Department of History and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University, and a beloved former member of the history department here at the University of Michigan. We still miss him. He is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. Michael studies Indigenous and early American history with a particular focus on the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley. His publications include An Infinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Earlier North America in 2012, and Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America, which was a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in History, was winner of the James A. Rowley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, the Coe Prize from the Western Historical Association, and the State History Prize from the Historical Society of Michigan. It is another one of those must-reads. Michael is also co-PI of the Inclusive History Project's 1817 project. With that, I will turn the podium over to Greg Dowd to get the evening's conversation off to a glorious start. Greg and fellow panelists, come on up.
Okay, thanks for the podium, John, but I'm going to sit because we're gonna get started. So welcome to What Does It Mean to Live with Treaties, our plenary roundtable on Indigenous history. And as you've already heard, this panel is a co-production of the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies and the Inclusive History Project at the University of Michigan. These two units teamed up last year to collaborate on the conference and on this panel. Our panelists bring together, as you've just heard, the most robust scholarship on Native American history and law. But more than that, they have collectively reshaped scholarship and publishing, I'd say, along the way. As we think about living with treaties, we at the University of Michigan recognize that for generations, our university seal has had on it the date 1817, the date of the Treaty of Fort Meigs, signed to the south of us in what is now Ohio. When it's Article 16, the land gift, of which you'll hear a great deal over the next few days, provided land that helped to finance the university. This symposium uses these 1817 origins in the treaty to get us to think about what treaties mean and what they mean today. So it's wonderful that we have eminent legal scholars and historians who've delved deeply into treaties, their histories, their living legacies, and their implications. Maggie Blackhawk will join us when she can. If she can get here in time, her flight is delayed. We have about 40 minutes, I'd say, of panel discussion, and then we'll save time for the public. I'm going to begin with a fairly straightforward question, and it's one that some of you have thought about. The treaties that the United States made with Native nations generally resulted, always resulted, from vast power asymmetries. Native leaders often faced, at least metaphorically, the barrel of a gun when they signed these treaties. It's fair to say, and our panelists have often said, that Native leaders signed treaties under duress. I think it's worth underscoring that. So I'm hoping that the panelists can give us just some examples, some idea of the kinds of either in Michigan or elsewhere, duress that Native leaders faced when entering these negotiations.
You would like me to start?
Sure.
Okay, I'm Ned. The history of treaties between Native nations and the federal government is an essential component of both Native American and U.S. history. I think we all agree with that here and throughout the weekend. But it's a kind of understanding that is not sufficiently understood, broadly speaking, across the academy, across K through 12 public education, and by our nation's citizenry. So we have to kind of constantly remind ourselves of these realities, in part because we live in a world saturated with misunderstandings about these subjects. And so the example, since you asked me, that I would point one to, for example, is the presence of U.S. military leaders at these treaty conferences or diplomatic accords, many of whom have often waged war, executed, and indeed even massacred Native communities. So there's a series of treaties in the region where my family and tribe are located, known as the Dottie Treaties, signed during the Civil War era in the 1860s. And the Colonel, Edward Patrick Connor, who led the Bear River Massacre of January of 1863, coming north from Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City and attacking a peaceable community of Northern Shoshone winter villagers across the Bear River near the Idaho-Utah border and massacring approximately 300 of them and leaving only remnants of remaining supplies and material for them to struggle with or to live on. He subsequently accompanied the superintendent of Indian Affairs named Dottie to the next round of treaty negotiations that Dottie was organizing with nearby Native nations, including my ancestors. So you can imagine how they felt when Connor shows up, and he helped actually advise John Evans, the territorial governor of Colorado, who was the second territorial governor appointed by the Lincoln administration, who instructed Chivington or helped encourage Chivington to attack peaceable Indians while they're sleeping in the winter or in the cold months at Sand Creek in 1864. So Connor's kind of fingerprints are all over histories of Indian massacres and violent encounters across the Great Basin and the American West more broadly. And he's just one individual who sat alongside superintendents of Indian Affairs telling Native nations and their communities what they should be essentially consenting to. So that's the kind of depth of, there are many other things to say about treaties, obviously, that we'll explore tonight, but that's one example.
I guess I would start out with a good example of the kind of coercion we're talking about by talking about the 1854 treaty signed by Gitche Bisheki, my ancestor, who was a principal leader of what became the Roy Cliff Reservation at the time. It's in northern Wisconsin, would be the southern lakeshore of Lake Superior. And the treaty commissioners had showed up, and this is in the removal era. In the removal era, the treaty commissioners were constantly trying to remove Indians from out of the Great Lakes, from Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. And they had some success in Ohio, but much less so in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, because there was less population pressure. But at this point, the Americans wanted access to the UP because of all the copper. And my ancestor was Ogima for the Lake Superior band that was under the negotiation. And the treaty commissioners came up with the idea that they were going to finally enact removal in the Upper Peninsula. And that was what was on the table. And they wanted, before the removal was signed, to cede the land in the Upper Peninsula so they could get access to mineral rights. And this negotiation went on back and forth with my ancestor saying, we don't want to cede any land. And I would note that we have a record of the conversation because there was a journal kept by a translator a mixed race guy named Henry Blatchford who was bilingual, and so kept a journal record. This isn't always the case for treaties. Sometimes there's a recording of the treaty process, and sometimes there's not. Often there's just the treaty itself and the correspondence between the commissioners and the Office of Indian Affairs. But here we actually have somebody recording the dialogue as it happens. And the commissioners were basically telling Gitche that if you don't sign it, we're taking the land anyway. And if you want to have any recourse for this, you'll have to sign now. And the resistance basically was a foregone conclusion that he wasn't going to be able to successfully resist. As Greg mentioned, the power disparities are great, but in the end, what Gitche did was he got an article put into the treaty that guaranteed the creation of a reservation, the Red Cliff Reservation, which wasn't in existence then. They had a reserved land that had been left over from an 1837 treaty that he had also signed that gave up 10 million acres in Wisconsin. And so he got the federal government to pledge to establish a permanent reservation in exchange for giving away the mineral rights. And he also got them to guarantee a right to continue hunting and harvesting in that land because they knew, Gitche knew that the Upper Peninsula, then as now, was not going to be filled with people coming in to settle. And so he wanted to continue to exercise sort of harvesting and hunting rights. And so those rights still persist. And Red Cliff was one of the people that pioneered in the 80s and 90s, hunting and fishing out of season, off record, getting arrested by game wardens so they could take the cases to court and have their sovereignty and their treaty rights sort of validated, which they did. And to this day, we're still hunting and fishing in this sort of ceded land. And they struggle for those rights doesn't get sort of validated in court until the 1980s, but it's established here in this 1854 treaty, which was, again, a treaty established under duress, but that people have agency and are able to resist back. Although I would come back and circle back and say they did try to actually remove the Ojibways from the southern Lake Superior Lakeshore the next year, but the people in the Lake Superior area protested the removal of those Indians because they wanted all that money that was coming in for annuities. Annuities brought cash money to that reservation, most of which was claimed by merchants for debt, up to about 99% per annum. And so the white people of Wisconsin did not want their Indians removed because it was a good source of money for them. So an example of both the coercion in treaties, but also resistance to that coercion.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Matthew? Or?
Yeah, I do.
I thought you might.
Your question is a great one, Greg, and I'm going to reference you, so that's my answer. But I want to say, first of all, I really appreciate being here. I'm a two-time graduate / loser of this institution, so I really appreciate being here again. And lots of relatives of mine have gone to the University of Michigan, so not as far back as 1817, but pretty far back. And so it's with a great amount of pride, frankly, that I can sit here and be a part of this. And the title you came up with, Living with Treaties, is just awesome because it has so many meanings. Like, yay, we live with these treaties. And also, shit, we live with these treaties. But I also think that these treaties are living documents. And the more that I learn about our culture, the more I realize that there's a lot more going on in the treaties that you'll see in the text of the treaties, which we, as lawyers elevate to the point of a fetish. And then, of course, the documents and the history around the treaties, so critically important to how those treaties are interpreted and understood and applied in court, also very, very important stuff. But I think that, what we really don't know, but we kind of do, is what the mindset and basically governance philosophies of the treaty negotiators was. And I won't talk about that right now. I'm interested in trying to answer Greg's question. I'll give you two examples. Maybe I shouldn't be answering this question. I'm not a historian, but I am an Indian lawyer, and we all have to be, to some extent, amateur historians. And so I guess you could say I'm more of a purveyor of historical gossip than anything else. And so two things. I am also a descendant of Leopold Pokagon, who is the namesake of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. My grandmother, for a short period of time after she was born, was called Laura Pokagon. And I sit on their court now, which is a really nice way to continue to be a part of that community. And my understanding, and this is all historical gossip, I've heard lots of stories about the negotiation in which the Pokagon Band was able to separate themselves out from many of the other northern Indiana, southwest Michigan Potawatomi tribes during the 1833 treaty negotiation. And one of those is my favorite one, which is also pretty dark. Every Pokagon Ogama went into a tent with military guys, and in that tent they were literally held at gunpoint, sign the treaty or you're dead. And after Pokagon heard that this is what was happening, he went in and sort of got the jump on the guys in the tent and sort of reversed the the bargaining position, so to speak. And that doesn't sound like it really happened, but as a metaphoric story, it really did. And the tribe was able to, Pokagon's band, basically, his family was able to avoid removal. They more or less had to go underground in exchange for promising to convert to Catholicism. And so they, for the longest time, became known as the Catholic Potawatomis of the St. Joseph River Valley. And if you go to the University of Notre Dame's campus, you're on Pokagon's land. So that's one. The other is the treaty I know a bit more about, the 1836 Treaty of Washington, which is the one that my tribe, Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, is one of the signatories to. And these 1830s treaties are the worst ones. They're all Andrew Jackson's treaties. He was the engineer of removal. He was a genocidal maniac known as the Indian Killer when he was elected president. And ultimately, he was a coward in a lot of ways. But the great thing about being in northern Michigan, maybe it's because there weren't enough population pressures here, but I think Andrew Jackson knew what it was like to invade a bunch of Indian tribes in their own homelands during when the weather is really terrible. And he did that repeatedly in Spanish Florida and pretty much killed all of his soldiers, in addition to all the Indians and enslaved persons. I don't think he was going to invade northern Michigan. I mean, it didn't work for Napoleon. So I don't think it was going to work for him either. But set that aside, he was the Indian Killer. They brought a couple of dozen Anishinaabe, Ogama, mostly Odawa, to Washington, D.C. The rest of you Ojibways are really smart. When you have your treaty negotiations, you'd put it down in a valley, and then you would surround the valley with all of your friends and family, a couple thousand Indians overlooking the treaty negotiations. We actually went to D.C., and I think there was a serious leadership blip there. But you're in the heart of evil when you're there negotiating Indian treaties. And so you had Andrew Jackson, you got Lewis Cass, who used to write these op-eds and papers for just to irritate people, saying we need to exterminate all the Indians in Michigan. So these are the people that we're negotiating with. And our treaty ultimately was partly certainly of duress, but also of just fraud. And I had heard this for the longest time since I was basically a kid in middle school and high school, from elders saying that our treaty was procured fraudulently. And I heard no specifics to this story until many decades later when Greg wrote basically the history of the treaty negotiation. And thanks to Henry Schoolcraft, there actually was a whole lot of fraud. And so, fuck that guy. But so, yeah, thank you. I told you I'm not really a historian. Look how professional these guys are. This is good. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And this is being recorded and broadcast. But you're right about Henry Schoolcraft. I've always thought somebody should write an opera about Henry and his wife, Jane, but really. But given this background, and I think you're right also about that journey to Washington and the inadequate representation of the tribal leaders there too. But even in a situation like that, the native signatories, it seems to me, often hoped to gain something for their peoples as they were working on that. Or they could. I mean, there might have been situations in which they did. I think Michael indicated, they were able to pull out, in his case, the Red Cliff Reservation and some also some rights to hunt, fish, gather, ceremony. So could we talk a little bit about under duress in, facing, metaphorically at least, or perhaps even literally, as this story suggests, the barrel of a gun. What agency did the tribal leaders have? How did they manage to push back? Do we have examples of that? that's worth looking into as well.
I'm happy to continue this conversation and maybe turn our attention further west to a region's history that I feel a little remiss not having learned when I lived there, but have learned more about having taught and written about the subject. And that's the Pacific Northwest. And I was just recently in Seattle for the first time since getting my PhD there in the 20th century. And I was really, this name won't probably be that familiar here outside of the Native Studies circles, but I was actually there on Billy Frank's Jr. Day, March 9th. And Billy Franks Jr. was a Nisqually fishing activist whose family had been persecuted for fishing, as Michael was talking about, on usual and accustomed lands, as the Stevens Point Treaty, or one of the Stevens Treaties that the territorial governor of Washington negotiated in 1855. And so they were contesting this process throughout the 20th century. And I think what we might take away from some of these conversations this evening and throughout the weekend is that this understanding that we're trying to gauge or focus upon is an essential component of, as I said earlier, U.S. and Native American history, but particularly of the kind of contemporary rise of Native nations across the North American landscape. And I didn't mention this in my little bio, or I should have, but I'm a proud graduate of the Detroit public school system. Thank you. Sixth grade, though I didn't complete high school there, but in the K through 8 system. My mom was a Detroit public school teacher. I almost went to the University of Michigan. Matthew and I would have likely been dorm mates in East Quad had it worked out. And for reasons that I won't get into, I decided to go to school across the river, we would say, in Detroit, in Canada. But that's why was I mentioning this is because in the 80s, which isn't too long ago, though a lot of the students here would feel differently. The place of Native peoples in contemporary America was almost non-existent. And I tell people routinely that I never, in my entire life, saw a representation of Native person that conformed in any semblance to my own lived experience. They're all in the past. If they were contemporary, they were on reservations. I was in the city. Nothing about, I delivered the Detroit Free Press for many years on the west side of Detroit. Occasionally, because I would read the paper every day while I'd walk the route, occasionally there would be a story about, a treaty case in Michigan or some kind of political negotiation occurring. But I knew nothing about Native American kind of contemporary politics, essentially. My family, was trying to kind of get me interested in these things. Eventually it worked out, but it took a while. And so the treaty rights struggles that Michael and Billy Franks in the Northwest, the implementation of getting these treaty commitments enacted has literally changed Indian country broadly, and brought and heightened levels of understanding and consciousness and engagement, restored ecological and cultural practices, a whole range of kind of just deeply transformative practices have ensued from these types of conversations. And so it brings me, as I think I can speak for all of us, tremendous joy to see this type of conversation happening at this level.
Okay, well, I'll talk about the 1817, the Fort Meigs Treaty, actually. So that treaty was negotiated by Lewis Cass, the treaty commissioner, and as Matthew mentioned, Lewis Cass, not a nice guy. He could have taught Schoolcraft a thing or two of being an asshole. He's negotiating this treaty in the Ohio Territory, and the Michigan, Article 16, which creates the Michigan transfer some land plots to the beginning of University of Michigan, but the main focus of that treaty actually was on the Wyandotte land in northern Ohio and southern part of Michigan. And the Wyandotte leader between the logs was adamant that he didn't want to give up the millions of acres that were being demanded. They got around that by Cass telling him that there were two Potawatomi translators who were not Potawatomi. There were two translators who were married to Potawatomi women and could speak Potawatomi. And Cass basically told the leader between the logs, if you don't sign, I'll get these two guys to get the Potawatomi to sign. So the coercion we've been talking about. So they signed the treaty, but then between the logs left the next day, traveled to Washington, D.C. and spoke before Congress and actually got an audience and told the Congress that the treaty had been coerced, that he'd been forced to give up way more land than they wanted. And they forced Lewis Cass to go back and renegotiate this treaty in 1818. So the St. Mary's Treaty. So that treaty actually never gets ratified. And it gets renegotiated because between the logs fought back and refused to accept something to the point of, and got himself an audience in Washington with the Congress. So
that's what Lewis Cass did to us too. All right.
He's busy.
Well, he had one trick, I think. Okay. So I'm glad you brought up Billy Frank because we have like sort of a Michigan Odawa version of Billy Frank. There's a bunch of them really, but the one that I'm most familiar with, partly because he was a Grand Traverse band, so Arthur Duhamel, and I was asked to, he died a long time ago, I was asked to talk a little bit about our 1836 treaty back in the day, and they had this big poster, looked just like this, but his quote was this: "I respect the law, that's why I broke it." And that says an enormous amount about, from my perspective. These treaties are actually law. And that was one of the first things I heard about from the elders about law, was that the treaties are the supreme law of the land. And the other thing they said was there's also something called the Indians Not Taxed Clause, and that means none of us should have to pay taxes. But I'm here to tell you we gotta pay our taxes. So, but anyway, the treaties establish some things that are critically important. The first one, it doesn't sound very good and it didn't work out for the most part, but it's probably the most important thing, is that it establishes a duty of protection between the United States and Indian tribes. This is our trust responsibility. And that comes from international customary law that long predates the United States. And the framers knew about a protectorate, or the notion of a protectorate, and that's why they wrote the Constitution the way they did. It's not the other way around. The provisions in the Constitution are there designed to implement and establish the legal infrastructure for what the United States would do in terms of its relationship with Indian tribes. And number one, they were going to do treaties. And number two, they were going to basically federalize Indian law, stripping the states and private parties of interest with tribal nations, which were effectively foreign nations. And that is so critical. I mean, the reason that in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, I know this is going to bore the hell out of you, but there's a Commerce Clause of the Constitution. It says Congress can regulate commerce. And did you know that? Okay. With three different kinds of sovereigns. The first one are state governments, and the second one is foreign nations, and the third one is Indian tribes. They're on the same sentence. And those are three sovereign nations. That would not be in there but for the notion of the duty of protection, I strongly suspect. And the fact that the U.S., it was always assumed, always understood, and had been for centuries before there was a United States, that colonizer/Indian tribe relationships were a form of a protectorate. And what does that mean for us now? It means our treaties are law. It means that we're sovereign nations. And it means what's in the treaties are really, really important. And so a lot of that stuff, like in the 1836 treaty, we usually just say skip ahead to the end, and that's Article 13. That's the part where we reserve the right to hunt and fish, and we stipulate to the right to hunt and fish on lands until they're required for settlement. And that's the core of our treaty rights basis. But that, to me, those are really good things, important things, even in the context of this coercion and fraud and misrepresentation and lots of other things, and all of the centuries, literal centuries of violation of the legal rights that are contained within the treaty. In a lot of respects, the fact that the U.S. made a decision to do that, was the reason that we're here now in a lot of respects. So.
Thank you. That's actually really it sums up, that's like a whole course in federal Indian law right there. I mean, in some ways, I mean, and it's, I know it's not, but it's, you just like grab the nub of it. So we're beginning to talk about implications for today and this notion of treaty rights, which, you know, a lot of us in the room kind of have a sense of what treaty rights means, but probably a fair number don't. So could we talk a little bit about just that pair of words, treaty rights? You know, when you encounter like people who don't, you know, haven't encountered this, how do you explain it to them? How do you discuss treaty rights into undergrads who may not have encountered it, for example?
Big questions. Treaty rights and Native American sovereignty are kind of abstractions for most people, but they're, as Matthew was saying, you know, essential to the development and organization of Native communities in contemporary America. I'm a little concerned that these ideas are kind of like antimatter, that they just can't be like digested into kind of normative understandings of American politics, civil rights, American history, which I've been focused on or interested in for most of my adult life now. And it just seems like we can, you know, make these efforts in certain spaces, take certain strides, build literatures, publish things, gain appointments and so forth. But it just doesn't quite seem to have like made it really that far into kind of national consciousness. And I think it's because these ideas are so kind of counterintuitive to understandings of what we think of as essential dimensions of the American experience. And we may not have all listened to the oral arguments in the recent birthright citizenship case, but the Solicitor General was not able to respond to Justice Gorsuch, among others, on these terms. Are American Indians birthright citizens? That's a complex question, but I've had to kind of think through it myself. But you know, I was thinking about it. I was talking the other day. My dad, who's watching my 5-year-old right now, his mom was not a birthright citizen. She was born in Nevada, rural community, only native speaking. You know, no record of her birth. Maybe she could have gotten citizenship had she applied for it. She wasn't a concern of hers. But in 1924, the United States passes a statute congressionally recognizing Native Americans. But that means statutorily passed initiatives are different than other forms of constitutional formation, right? So Matthew can explain this far more clearly than I can. But if Congress passes a statute to do one thing, it can pass a statute to do something else not too long from there. So this is the types of things that's really hard for people to understand. So treaty rights, what exactly are they? How do we communicate them? I always think about past historical experiences, and the example I kind of wanted to mention this evening in this space was a new provision I've learned about another extremely important treaty in the Great Lakes, south of here in Ohio, is the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. It essentially ends a very long-standing or kind of prolongs or brings it to, you guys know this better than I do, you know, but the Treaty of Greenville has a provision in it that I never really understood until I read this recent book that just won the Bancroft Prize called Vested Interest by Emily Connolly, which another one of the must-reads in our field. So many things to do, right? Reading and, you know, but it just, and I had just written about this not too long ago. And this is this extraordinarily important treaty negotiation that essentially grants much of the Ohio territory, which has been contested, as everyone here knows, for many, many years to the federal government. But there's a provision in there for annuity distributions, where the tribal negotiators are asking for this distribution of not lump sum payments, which, you know, it's kind of like one of these strange, since we're speaking a little informally at times this evening, it's one of those like do you take the lottery payment all at once or over 30 years, right? Michigan instituted a lottery back in the 80s, as some of you may know, and we used to watch it every weekend. And just like, oh, would you take it for one payment or for 30 years, right? So here they are, the treaty negotiators saying, we want an annual commitment. Many Native tribes received those types of annual commitments both before and after the constitutional formation. That annuity commitment by the federal government started being utilized in all these extraordinarily complicated and fascinating ways to such an extent that eventually the federal government's failure to offer those annuities yielded the largest class action lawsuit in American history, known as the Cobell Settlement. So here's this entire dimension of American history coming from these treaty provisions, these treaty, what did you call them?
Rights?
Rights, exactly. So those are the kind of things that history kind of opens up kind of vistas of insight that are just so kind of counterintuitive. And we often hear in Native American communities and studies and spaces that somehow these are special
rights.
Right, exactly. But as Matthew was saying, these are the supreme law of the land outlined by the Constitution. This isn't something that is just kind of preferential treatment or something. This is the law. Right? And if you don't abide by your own laws, then we're not all actually operating on the same playing field. So it's a hard question to answer, but that was my effort.
So treaty rights, if I'm explaining to students, not at Columbia, so I'm in the Northeast, I just say, anytime you walk into the Mohegan Sun Casino, just think to yourself, treaty rights. That's how I got there. Similarly, there's where my family's from, Red Cliff has a legendary Waters Casino. And I'm not holding my breath that reparations or land back's coming our way, but we're implementing our own reparations thing 1 quarter at a time at the legendary Waters Casino. So, treaty rights. And then I would frame that in a more serious treaty rights discussion in that when I mentioned the 80s and 90s, when people started doing this spearfishing offshore, it inflamed a lot of people in northern Wisconsin. A lot of those people make their money doing, outdoor, people go out there, there's a short season, but people go out the lakes, the fishing, the camping. And so a lot of people were upset because part of when the treaty rights were affirmed, Ojibwas could take up to 100% of the walleye catch if they wanted to. They wouldn't, but that was the accusation. And so there was just furious reaction, protesting, people trying to harm, hurt, or kill people who were spearfishing. And this happened for years, that people were incensed that why does this set of people from Wisconsin have rights that this set of people from Wisconsin doesn't have? And so, that's partly why I went to graduate school, is that the conundrum that I experienced with people out there protesting this with signs like Custer should have finished the job signs. And it wasn't just the racism for that, it was the ahistorical nature of that claim. The Indians existed on the Great Plains in the 19th century. They didn't exist in the Great Lakes. And the inability to understand why people had those rights was profound. Although I say that, and now you can go to, at the time, you couldn't get close to the reservation without getting protests. Now, if you go to the Red Cliff Reservation, there's not just the casino, but also part of the Apostle Islands Lakeshore National Park has been taken over by Red Cliff, and we administer part of that and do all kinds of canoeing, kayaking. So that now if you go to the Red Cliff Reservation on any given day, you're going to see tons of, well, in the summer anyway, not so much in the winter, but you're going to see tons of white people walking around, going between the casino and camping on the islands and stuff like that. So at one point they were really upset about the treaty rights. Another point, they learned to live with the treaty rights and take advantage of them. So it is complex, but often there's a lot of resistance to the idea of indigenous sovereignty or a set of separate rights that are with that. But then, again, give somebody a casino and they'll learn to get on board with it. So
that's good. I'd like to start with, I already talked a little bit about hunting and fishing rights. Those are kind of explicit in a lot of the treaties. Not all, but a lot of them. A lot of reservations are created by treaties, and those reservation boundaries are also legal. And we have a lot of law that suggests that reservation boundaries don't just go away because a bunch of non-Indians are living on your reservation. They remain extant until a court or Congress abrogates them, makes them go away. But really, if what you're really asking here, I think, is why is it that tribes do the things they do? Imagine every single kind of governmental function that an Indian tribe does, and you could point to a treaty at some point that originated. Not every single treaty has all the exact same stuff in it, but if you think of a tribe's housing department, there are lots of treaties, dozens of them, that reference the fact the federal government is going to provide resources to allow tribes to build housing. If you think about a health clinic that a tribe operates, think about all the different times that the United States went in to a sick and ill community, tribal community, and offered to do smallpox vaccinations and provide other healthcare and services and offer a physician for the reservation. If you think about the tribes that have a police department, a lot of treaties reference the fact that they're going to guarantee public safety on the reservation. Everything that a tribal government does that pretty much has, at least in some respect, an origin with a treaty right, a provision in the treaty. And if Congress, one of the things that Congress has done, and I don't know if this is a good thing, but it's mostly a good thing, is that if they're going to provide health care to one tribe, they've agreed to provide health care to all the tribes. And yes, it's lousy health care, unless the tribal government has resources and can take over the function for themselves, and then they actually make it really nice health care. But generally speaking, everything relates back to a treaty in a lot of respects. And really, that's the federal government's obligation to do something. My favorite treaty right is Indian preference. And there was a provision in the 1836 treaty that says the government's going to provide a blacksmith for every one of the bands that signed the treaty. And when a Grand Traverse band got its blacksmith, it was a guy from Sault Ste. Marie. His name was Johnston, who was related to Henry Schoolcraft, although they were buddies, but they were not buddies. And we sent him back and said, we want a Grand Traverse band member to be our blacksmith, not this other Indian guy. And everything you can imagine sort of comes from treaty rights and that from a treaty language. And I think that's kind of neat that you can relate back all these things. And yes, tribes did also establish in a lot of treaties the right to economic activity. I mean, if you look at, I think one of my favorite things that happened in U.S. v. Michigan was the state of Michigan and the non-Indian hunting and sports commercial fisher people were saying, well, if you're gonna have hunting and fishing rights, all you get is subsistence rights, and that's basically the right to have to feed your family for a very short temporary period of time. That's what subsistence is. And we said, no, we actually have right to commercial hunting and fishing and to market the stuff we actually catch. And the reason we know that is because there's a provision in there in the 1836 treaty that says the government's going to provide salt barrels to us so that we can store our fish and transport it to market. So everything sort of has a connection. And I think that's kind of how actually, some of my students are in here, so they know that's not how I explain treaty rights. But if you ever ask me to do that, that's what I would say.
So I think we're getting there. And I'd like to turn now to talk about universities, since we're in one. And the past decade has, and I know this has been going on a lot longer, but there have been a series of pretty specific revelations about how Native American dispossession funded American universities. And most notably, or very notably at least, Tristan Ahtone and Robert Lee, among others, demonstrated the continental extent to which U.S. higher education stands on the sale of Native American land through, for example, the much honored 1862 Morrill Act that created land-grant university system. And decades before the Morrill Act, as our teams here at Michigan are finding, in part through the acquisition and sale of indigenous land, the university developed some of its finances. Not only Article 16 and the Treaty of Fort Meigs, but also other federal land grants. And even before that, it just continues to go back. I recently saw that Harvard undergraduates have uncovered that there's a pre-revolutionary history of land takings that provided funding for that university. And there's really no surprise if you think about it, land being one of the major sources of wealth anywhere, and land being absolutely fundamental to wealth in the early republic and in the 19th century US, and even today, great source of wealth. No surprise really that since all that land was ultimately taken from Native Americans, that it would be at the source of much financing. So given that we know that, what can colleges and universities do seriously, practically, to reckon with this past? And how do we think, how's a good way to think about our roles and responsibilities, as members of universities and as stewards of those universities to work toward an answer to, to these problems? Sorry.
I know there are a lot of university affiliated community members here. So we have faculty, students, graduate students, I met some, and university administrators. These are challenges, obviously, that Native American faculty have been dealing with for a long time, myself included, the generations beforehand. And I think we can collectively say, or at least I'll say, we could use a little more help. Because the university worlds that you're describing are not sufficiently kind of structured to attend to these subject matters. And we just heard from Alphonse that in Canada, at the university systems in Ontario, the Ojibwe language is being prioritized. That's not true south of the border throughout many, many states. And particularly throughout many private university and college worlds. So I have a brief anecdote that may be helpful. Michael and Matthew, I think, were both referencing, but in particular, a decision in Wisconsin known as the Voigt decision that affirmed essentially Wisconsin's Indian Nations off-reservation fishing and hunting rights. And in part because of I taught at Madison, the university there for 10 years, and in part of the discord and strife that made Wisconsin throughout the 80s, the Mississippi of the North, as one of the PBS stories called it. The state government passed a budgetary act that made the K-12 instruction of Indian history, treaty rights, and culture mandatory across the state's system. They created a Department of Public Instruction office for Native American enforcement, and the state was trying essentially to remedy this problem by teaching its youngest citizens, the future generation and its leaders, these subject matters. When I arrived onto the faculty there in 1999, there was no one in the School of Education teaching Native American educational history. And there are like 13 departments in the University of Wisconsin School of Education consisting of over 100 faculty members. And so I met with I'll cut this short, but we tried essentially to change that. And we met with the dean, with the Native American Studies program leaders, and we tried to put some pressure in that direction. And I casually mentioned that I thought the School of Education wasn't complying with state budgetary educational commitments by not instructing its future teachers in these areas as the state law was requiring. And I said, perhaps you might lose your accreditation to like one of the largest, most powerful schools of education in the country. Junior faculty member. So that's the kind of world that we kind of inhabit. And I'll try not to reveal too much, but just to kind of underscore the kind of struggles that really remain in kind of getting real commitments brought to these subject areas.
Thanks.
What you're here for tonight is part of that. Michigan has been stalwart. I mean, 1817 project. It's grown out of actually from the 2017 bicentennial when the faculty member in charge of the bicentennial committee asked me to do a speech about the founding of the University of Michigan. I said, okay, but it's not going to be very nice. And they were like, no problem. So I think there has been a commitment to this, and the 1817 project has been doing amazing work. They brought me back to do some more of this work here with the amazing team on the 1817 project. Undergraduates, graduates, professors, everyone's doing research. There's so much more than just this initial exchange. I mean, the University of Michigan continued throughout its early history to sort of build itself as an institution by acquiring and selling native land. And that's a microcosm of the United States, writ large. And I think so what the university is doing now in trying to not only make public-facing knowledge about this process available, not just to the university community, but to the wider community, is super important. And I said it's a microcosm of the world at large. Think about the things you do know. Think about everything from the Morrill Act to the creation of land-grant colleges funded by native land. They took native land, turned it into financial instruments, and distributed by state according to population. And then people sold that in order to pay for their public universities. So it's not that they gave them land in the form of financial scripts that was then sold, profits of which were then plowed into their endowments. Think about the railroad. The Railroad Act was also funded by land grants taken from native peoples, given as script to entrepreneurs who were in the railroad business, and they made the railroads that way. Think about the Homestead Act, which allowed people to subsidize basically family farms throughout the West. Also, it was transfer of wealth from native people to the American public. So much of the public infrastructure in this country comes out of these land grants. And so making that more public, and also just helping to make people aware of it. You don't have to feel guilty about what 19th century people did, but you have to be aware of the way in which we all benefit from what happened, about this massive transfer of wealth and land. So we should be cognizant that the things that we enjoy from all these processes have come at a great cost. We should know that's where we're coming from. And I'll end by just saying that University of Michigan has continued to do the 1870 project in the middle of whatever the fuck this is. So hats off.
You guys don't know this, but there's a clock here ticking down. And every word that Ned and Mike will say is one less word than I get to say.
I'll keep
It's
talking.
like oral argument.
We'll keep talking then.
Yeah. So here we go. I got 2 minutes, so it's fine. I'm going to keep babbling on for 19 more seconds first, though. So years ago, we was at Michigan State University, our Indigenous Law and Policy Center, and a lot of people don't know this, but we're sort of in the forefront of defending the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so there's this big lawsuit filed by the state of Texas, and we knew it was coming, and we sat down over the course of the next few months and figured out basically the next 6 or 7 years of our research agenda was to write the work that we needed to do to, as scholars, to shore up the constitutionality of the statute. And the first big paper that we focused on was to track the history of the duty of protection / trust responsibility of the federal government directly towards Indian children. So just like if there's some oblique phrase in a treaty that can actually justify a lot of things that Congress does, same thing is true for the earliest few decades of the United States. If Congress did something in Indian affairs at that time, that was an acknowledgement of the founding generation of the U.S. Constitution that was authorized by the Constitution. So we wanted to trace this all the way back. And Indian Child Welfare Act was from 1978, and it's really a reaction to the adopting out and the removal of Indian kids from their homes by the state governments and church organizations. And that is a legacy of boarding schools, and we all knew this stuff when we're putting it back together. And then we had to do the original sort of beginning of when the boarding school type, the really bad boarding schools really started. But before that, there was a civil war, and Congress was funding orphanages because what happens in wars, people's parents die, and you got all these kids running around, so you have to throw them in a little baby jail. And there were trust funds associated with that. But the real origin, the first time we saw Congress spend money on Indian kids was for Dartmouth. Eleazar Wheelock asked for some money during the American Revolution. And he said, I have this idea. We're up here in the middle of nowhere, and Maggie Blacklock's here. So just to finish my story, we're in the middle of nowhere, Eleazar Wheelock says, and we're in the woods, and we're surrounded by the war. We're surrounded by Indians too. So what if we take these Indians into the school, and you can fund it for us, and then no Indian tribe will attack us because their kids are here. And I think he actually used the word hostages. We'll keep them as hostages here. And that was sort of one of the very first times Congress ever spent money on Indian kids, and it was right around the time, way back at the beginning of the founding of the American Revolution and founding of the Republic. And I thought, here's your sad little origin story to the trust responsibility. But that's what we had to do to prove all this stuff was related. So, and time's up.
Okay.
You really just are here for him, I think.
Well, welcome, Maggie. Why don't you join us for the Q&A, which I think it's time we can turn over to the crowd here, the audience, and I see Amy Stillman's hand is up already.
Yeah, thank you for dropping wisdom. Great job. My question is actually very simple. And thank you, Greg, for laying out the 1817 origins of this university in a treaty, a land gift that came through a treaty, which is distinct from many of the land-grant universities that sit on lands more egregiously obtained later in the 19th century. Okay, so the university has done, so far, a very poor job of honoring Article 16 in terms of addressing the aspirations of the chiefs who signed it, that their children would be educated. There is a groundswell, there has been a groundswell of work to push the university on that. And I can say thanks to the support of President Grasso and Provost Macaulay, some of that work is in fact starting up again and will move forward. But my real question is, given the pride with which the university takes that U of M sits on gifted lands, okay? But what you have told us very clearly tonight is that treaties are broken and treaties were signed under duress, okay? And so my question is in part, comes out of a number of student organizations on campus wanting to demonstrate their allyship and support, have plastered land acknowledgements on their websites saying the University of Michigan sits on stolen lands, okay? And I spent a good part of the last 3 years sending out email messages saying, to different student orgs saying, there was this treaty and the treaty says the land is gifted, but we know there's this history of treaties being broken and treaties being signed under duress. So my question is simply, does this university sit on stolen land?
The continent is stolen.
Sorry?
The continent is stolen. So,
yeah, definitely. Simple answer to a simple question. You mean you want to know how it happened or why? That's a much more difficult thing. That's for historians.
It's a great question, actually, and I think it's a question that we can't, we can answer as Michael, like the whole continent. At the same time, it's a question that is good to kind of sit there with and to hang on to.
I'd like to take a swing at it, if you don't mind as well. I'm not anyone's lawyer here, so I can't quite adjudicate those things. However, I think the framing that the United States is on stolen land is a helpful framing, but it also holds us back in a certain respect, because it puts that act in the past only. I know in law schools, we, before Matthew Fletcher came to the University of Michigan Law School, we had really only Indian law potentially in property law classes, and only at the very beginning. You get Johnson versus McIntosh. The land was stolen. We have our new property regime. Let's move on. And I think that framing, again, puts everything in the idea of, well, we're not going to give Louisiana back, of course. This is like the argument that the United States used to annex Hawaii. We're not going to give Louisiana back, so we might as well just keep doing this. So I think it's helpful to also think about it in terms of empire, in terms of colonialism, in the sense that the United States not only stole land from Native people, it also formed legal instruments with them in treaties and violated its own laws. It unilaterally abrogated its own supreme laws to the point where Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, who's very friendly to federal Indian law, starts off a case saying at the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise, not a law or a treaty or a supreme, not an unlawful act, but a promise that was potentially broken. And so seeing this as an ongoing harm, not just a theft in the past, but a deeper fundamental problem of government in the United States where we govern other people by force. We violate our own lawmaking agreements. We don't make law collaboratively with other governments. Instead, we just run over them rickshaw. And so calling this land stolen, I think, has become similar to that land acknowledgement. It's lost its power. And so if there are ways, especially in times like this when we're looking at so many forms of democratic and constitutional crisis on all sorts of fronts, to understand the ways in which this isn't just a theft. This wasn't just, someone taking a bicycle 200 years ago. This is actually a fundamental problem of government, of law, of constitutionalism that is ongoing. We govern 3 million people in Puerto Rico today by force. We intervene in their government. We're intervening in other governments. These are big fundamental lessons to be able to take away. And of course, we're coming back to one university with one treaty, but failure to uphold those conditions on that land grant in that treaty is far more problematic than just a simple theft. And I hope that we can reflect on that while we can also say, stolen land acknowledgement, but to also take it further, to really have that deep introspection about what the wrong is when you're looking at a treaty that hasn't been upheld on the other side of the bargain by these institutions in an ongoing way. Today, tomorrow, not just 200 years ago, not just in 1817, but, today.
Yay. Yes, I see the green arm in the back. Right here. Oh, okay.
Hola a todos, bonjour, what up, everyone? Sorry, I'm just thinking right now of how to say this exactly correct. So, in my time of working with Manoomin, with different tribes here, some elders told me, including like Kathy Smith from Keweenaw and Roger Levin from Lac Vieux des Ayres, that all treaties in so-called Michigan, right, go back to the first treaty of creation with the rest of non-human nations. And so with that, I wanted to ask if you could speak on that and how the responsibilities and rights from the first treaty still play in the modern context of University of Michigan, or how should they play? And as well as like touching on other things such as like the Seven Fire Prophecy.
That's great, thanks. I think that's right. So you have to think of a treaty negotiator from an indigenous community sitting with the colonizer, and for many indigenous nations, the Anishinaabe Nation, especially in Canada, they're much more explicit about this, but they say that the part of the negotiation and the text of the treaty is designed as an educational, it's like schooling the colonizer. Like, this is our land. And it's not our land in terms of ownership necessarily, but we've learned how to live in this land. We live in harmony. We understand our place in this creation. Anishinaabe is where we are now. And so when the part of the negotiation that I imagine is just not simply part of the historical record, because maybe it's not translatable. American treaty negotiators, interpreters probably didn't speak the language all that well, and they probably had no idea what these guys were talking about half the time. But what they were talking about was this: you know you're coming in here. We're starting a kinship relationship with you, and you need to know how to live here. And to me, that is something that is totally absent from treaty litigation and treaty interpretation, certainly for the most part from the treaty text. But I always point to, look at the logo of our conference. You have the clan dodoms there. You have them right there. And that is a representation of the entities to which humans aspire to be. You know, these are the things that are more powerful and wise than we will ever be. That's why we want to be like them. That's why, you're from Makwa Dodem, or you're from Migizi Dodem. That's who you are, and that's who your goals are to be. And I think that's part of the treaties that are really, really important, that are totally missed. And, to complete the astrophysics metaphors, I mean, in a lot of respects, that's the dark matter of treaties. It can't be discovered, but it will be eventually, and we'll understand more.
When we interpret treaties with other governments, so not Indian treaties, you have to read into the treaty the intent of both sovereigns to be able to understand the meaning of the text. And so inevitably, and this isn't just the Indian canon, this isn't just because we didn't think Native people were co-equal bargainers. It's truly with every single treaty, the broader principles for the last 200 years in the United States have been that we have to read the interpretive principles, the ideas of this other sovereign into that treaty negotiation. That's the point. So when you think about a treaty, it's a collaborative lawmaking vehicle. And for the first 100 years of the United States, the majority of treaties that it formed were with Native nations. And those treaties, because of the United States Constitution, were the supreme law of the land. They were even believed by some to actually amend the Constitution itself, because they were seen as so supreme. And if you read it in that context, what you can hear from Professor Fletcher's description is a way in which tribal law, tribal governance, tribal political and legal perspectives were brought within the fabric, the warp and weft of the United States constitutional framework through these treaties over time, where Native people believed they were shaping the United States, the North America entirely, by working together with this other sovereign to come up with a lawmaking framework for these areas. So the treaties offer, and continue through treaty substitutes, offer a framework that we already have, just one that we don't recognize. So Kaplan's treaties, that's supposed to publish all treaties that are still in force in the United States, up until maybe 6 years ago, didn't publish so-called, quote, Indian treaties, even though they're still in force, even though we still litigate them. They just didn't publish them with the rest of the treaties because they were Indian treaties and they went someplace else. When we confronted the database about that discrepancy, they told us, well, the U.S. government doesn't publish these treaties together. It says they're Indian treaties and they're different. And I said, well, if we have a scholarly inquiry, when have we ever used the government's own categories to drive our own analytical category here? And you've basically sloughed it off. So if you search for all the treaties, none of these other treaties show up. And so we have 100 years of collaborative lawmaking, and I would argue much longer through treaty substitutes with Native nations that have formed fundamental law within the U.S. We're just ignoring them. We're ignoring the ways in which tribal law and tribal perspectives have long been part of what has become the United States, what has become the state of Michigan.
And if I might add, very briefly, the discipline of political science has misconstrued the kind of division of governmentality across American government. They talk about municipal, state, and federal authorities, never mentioning tribal communities. I know the university here has a very renowned political science department and community. It'd be really nice, as we were talking earlier, to see broader commitments made in particular fields to these subject areas. And it's very, very difficult for political scientists to really enter into these conversations in ways that Maggie and others have discussed.
Ani, my name is Jade. I'm a Lakota. Woo! But I, like probably many people in this room, grew up in a lot of intergenerational trauma on both sides of my family. And so while I won't cast judgment upon them for their actions, I can say that I was raised by many abusive people. And as a child, you have rights, but if your parents decide you don't have rights, then you don't have rights. And they can pretty much do what they want to you. And I view settler colonialism and entities like the University of Michigan as an abusive entity. And so if they harm us and then they say, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that, but then they don't do anything to give us more rights and neutralize that power imbalance, then really they are manipulating and further harming and trying to confuse us. And so I kind of wonder, as much as I like this and as excited as I am to learn, what rights has U of M returned to Indigenous peoples? I know that they're denying educational rights. I know that they hold lands like Burt Lake Band's lands, and they could very feasibly give back some of those land rights. If not in fee simple, they could give back a few sticks in the bundle of sticks. They could return cultural easements. They could do a plethora of things, and yet this I see as perhaps placating us or dragging their feet in returning our rights. So yeah, do you know what rights have been returned? And if they haven't been returned, then dang, I guess it's time we demand that they start returning our rights, isn't it?
I mean, I am always a big fan of liberal democracy and of forums for free and open discourse on academic topics. I am deeply committed to those principles. I suggest that we try it someday. But I do think that forums like this, clarifying issues, having those conversations are incredibly important, even though they may seem incredibly frustrating when you essentially pick off that scab and feel the actual wound for the first time. But the erasure of these topics, it muddles them. It makes it to where we don't understand the law. We don't understand the normative frameworks around them. We don't understand the history of it. And that damage is real too. And I think that, I completely agree. As a legal scholar who spends half of my life doing one thing where I'm demanding action in a particular way or defending in a particular way, and researching on the other side, I think that the research, especially at these institutions, is incredibly important. And I am at least heartened by the audience here who are themselves having a conversation about topics that rarely make it into places like this. That's part of the frustration that you're hearing, and I think rightly so. And so I do think that there's a space for action, and the hard part is when you get land acknowledgement after land acknowledgement, you never actually get the land back part of it, or at least even the treaty condition part of it. But to have these conversations, I do think pushes the envelope forward a little bit every time, I hope. But what that means is that you all have to take this out with you and not just turn it off tomorrow, and actually see it as the top of your list for something to learn about and something to clarify and something to change. Otherwise, this may go back to silence again and back to the erasure of these conversations. The reason why these universities need to do more is so more of these conversations can happen, because once you hear it, you go, okay, yes, I do believe, I hear the arguments. They're pretty persuasive, but the problem is you just don't give us a forum for them very often. And I think this is an opportunity, as frustrating and as painful as it is.
Thank you so much, Sarah Nahar. My question, and kind of builds on this question of the stolen piece. Often now, groups are saying it's all stolen land built by stolen hands. And what that does is really powerful in linking the dispossession of Indigenous communities and the possession of Africans and the dispossession of both of us in different ways in these moments and times. And so as, really appreciating, like Land Back's manifesto says, Black liberation and Indigenous land back are linked, Indigenous sovereignty are linked, and making more of these connections. And I'm not sure that they've happened legally. So these are my questions in terms of where are we legally in connecting our struggles? And like, as we talked about explaining treaty rights and how that gets obscured while civil rights has a way of being, at least people think they understand them. Would the encouragement be to name those together all the time? Would it be to continue to nuance how the different ways we're experiencing legal oppression? Or what word might you have to others who are living on Turtle Island who are not in control of the federal government but experiencing ongoing dispossession and colonization? Thanks.
Keep doing this. I was late, so I don't feel as, yeah, exactly. I'm like the pitch hitter. It's a sports ball reference. Okay. So it's fascinating to me that the word colony was initially interchangeable with the word plantation. It was a legal framework to govern non-subject populations in a condition of extraction. And that meant everyone within that framework. I think over time we've lost the resistance strategies that Native people have offered. And I don't want to essentialize this to say that it's only Native people who have turned towards sovereignty and treaties and self-determination, because of course we have massive decolonial frameworks. You have maroon communities, of course, yeah, exactly, who are charged or are still trying to enforce treaty rights in Haiti. So you have overlap. The trust doctrine was applied to Liberia, for example, which was an odd colony of the United States, built in Africa. So there are spaces of legal overlap, deep legal overlap. But I think that the effort you're hearing to think about sovereignty and self-determination and treaties as a distinctive space of resistance is real, because those histories, not to say that we haven't, fought endlessly to get the abolition of human enslavement and civil rights and the civil rights strategies into these same institutions in the same way. Human enslavement wasn't actually taught as part of the constitutional law curriculum in most law schools until the 90s. And then it was scholars essentially fighting to get that into the curriculum. And we're only now really pressing to get these conversations into the constitutional law curriculum today. So the reason we're trying to disambiguate them is because they are different strategies. They've overlapped. They have been engaged in by Black Americans, by Native Americans at different times. But there's this whole history that is really just aching to be uncovered or rediscovered, for just to toss an example this way, in the ways that Native peoples have resisted oppression. And I think they're getting more and more important as we are trying to understand forms of authoritarianism that are resurging in the United States. And ways in which Native peoples have long resisted these forms of authoritarianism rather than the Jim Crow segregation forms of authoritarianism, the human enslavement forms of authoritarianism. These are different flavors of problems within what is our constitutional democracy. And so to see these fights as separate, to see these forms of resistance as separate is only it's a clarification project. It's that of scholars. But to bring them together, I think, is an effort to expand the toolkit and to say that these struggles may have been at times different, and so the resistance strategy is different, but that doesn't have to do with these communities per se. It has to do with different forms of oppression and different periods of U.S. history that have often overlapped.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'd like to add, I mean, I really struggle with the notion of rights. One of the reasons I struggle, and I don't know if you've noticed, but one of the things I do is when people start talking about treaty rights, I immediately turn them into property rights. And the reason I do that is because the Constitution is a property rights constitution. It includes, it's a protection of slavery, it's a protection of indigenous dispossession, but really it's a protection of the legal, political, and property interests of the wealthy elite. And when we talk about, when you look at the text of the Constitution, you don't see any human rights there. There's no right to education or healthcare or anything like that. What there are individual civil rights. And that immediately silos and separates us. And I don't know if that was on purpose because I don't think the framers were nearly as smart as we give them any credit for, but the effect is devastating. We silo everything. If you want to make an equal protection claim, the first thing you have to do is point out the people who are similarly situated to you and how they are treated differently. So we're siloing people in our civil rights jurisprudence. And that, I believe, is fully intentional on the part of the United States Supreme Court. So that's why you have in the 60s Vine Deloria saying things, we don't have anything in common with African-American civil rights movement. I mean, it's great that that's going on, yay, we're gonna take some of your tactics and you can borrow from us, but fundamentally we're different. And I think where, to me, and even property rights is still just playing defense, right? You're just talking in the language of the master. But to me, where the real action is tribal governance, where tribes are self-governing themselves and they have an enormous amount of space in which to be creative, in which to incorporate indigenous culture, customs into the things they do. And some of that is bleeding out into, in a good way, to non-Indian governments. I mean, in Michigan, we're exporting all sorts of tribal court practices that local courts are borrowing. There's a peacemaker court in Washtenaw County down the road from here. And that sounds a little bit insane, and maybe it is, but they're taking from us, they're learning from us little by little. And to me, that is where the real action is, not necessarily in a fighting over rights, although that doesn't mean stop. If you win a civil rights case, you get attorney's fees.
The dispossession is also simultaneous. The Northwest Ordinance, which creates the Northwest Territory, which creates these new states out of this sort of coercively dispossessed land that comes from Native people. The first states in the Northwest Territory that become states, Ohio and Illinois, the first thing they do, I should back up and say the Northwest Ordinance includes a provision that all states in the Northwest Territory have to be free states, not slave states. The first thing that the first two states in the territory do when they become states, Ohio and Illinois, are pass a series of black laws that are aimed at preventing free black people from migrating to the states and becoming citizens. They pass laws that if you migrate, you have to go to justice of peace, pay a $500 bond, which is a lot of money in 19th century money, and then you also have to provide freedom papers to prove that you're free. They create laws that say if you hire a black person, they have to have proof that they paid that bond, that they have provided the justice of the peace, proof of their freedom. So they set up a series of laws that make it harder for free black people to move into these territories, and they also are taxing people and doing that. So at the same time this is happening, when I'm writing this book and writing about these laws and the way that they're connected with dispossession, is when Standing Rock happens and when Michael Brown was killed and people start taking to the streets. So the history, this is a feature, not a bug, of the American system. And so where we can resist are moments like this when that feature becomes super apparent and we have to push back.
I'm being instructed to say thank you to Maggie Blackhawk and Matthew Fletcher and Michael Witkin and Ned Blackhawk. And thank you all for coming. This is a great, great crowd. Thank you.
As we conclude this evening, thank you again for coming and for our speakers. The Roundtable is made possible by the partnership of the Inclusive History Project and the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. We look forward to continuing this dialogue and conversation. Please bring your questions tomorrow. Please bring your present. And also, please bring back your name tags and your programs. If you don't have a program, you don't know the players. We kick off tomorrow morning at 9:15 in the console room, which is one floor down from here. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening.